Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started, good luck. What is a common use case for AWS CodePipeline? Automating software release pipelines. Monitoring Amazon S3 buckets. Configuring AWS IAM policies. Creating Amazon EC2 instances. A common use case for AWS CodePipeline is automating the release pipelines for software applications, enabling continuous integration and delivery practices. How does AWS CodePipeline integrate with AWS CodeCommit? As a database service. As a source provider. As an email service. As a machine learning tool. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS CodeCommit as a source provider to retrieve the source code for applications managed in the pipeline. What action type in AWS CodePipeline is used for deploying applications to AWS Lambda functions? AWS CodeDeploy. AWS Lambda. AWS CloudFormation. AWS EC2. AWS Lambda is the action type used for deploying applications to AWS Lambda functions within AWS CodePipeline. What is the typical role of AWS CodeBuild in AWS CodePipeline? To build and package source code. To configure AWS IAM roles. To manage Amazon Route 53 DNS records. To deploy applications to Amazon EC2 instances. AWS CodeBuild in AWS CodePipeline is typically used to build, test, and package source code before deploying it using subsequent pipeline stages. What is an Amazon CloudWatch events rule used for an AWS CodePipeline? To trigger pipeline executions based on events. To configure AWS IAM policies. To monitor Amazon RDS instances. To manage Amazon EBS volumes. An Amazon CloudWatch events rule in AWS CodePipeline is used to trigger pipeline executions automatically based on events within AWS services or external sources. What AWS service is commonly used for manual approval actions in AWS CodePipeline? AWS Step Functions. AWS IAM. Amazon SNS. Amazon SQS. Amazon SNS is commonly used for manual approval actions in AWS CodePipeline to notify stakeholders for approval steps in the pipeline. How does AWS CodePipeline integrate with AWS CodeDeploy? As a data warehousing solution. As an action provider. As a content delivery network. As a serverless compute service. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS CodeDeploy as an action provider to facilitate automated deployments of applications managed by CodePipeline. What is the purpose of AWS CodePipeline's approval action type? To manually approve or reject a pipeline execution. To manage AWS IAM policies. To schedule Amazon ECS tasks. To configure Amazon CloudFront distributions. AWS CodePipeline's approval action type is used to introduce manual approval steps into a pipeline, allowing stakeholders to approve or reject the pipeline's progress. What is an action in AWS CodePipeline? A type of Amazon RDS database instance. A task performed on a deployment artifact. An AWS S3 bucket. An AWS IAM user. An action in AWS CodePipeline represents a single task performed on the artifacts of your application source, such as deploying to a server or validating the build. What is the purpose of a transition in AWS CodePipeline? To automate AWS Lambda function deployments. To move pipeline execution from one stage to the next. To create a new AWS IAM user. To manage Amazon S3 buckets. A transition in AWS CodePipeline facilitates moving pipeline execution from one stage to the next, ensuring the automated flow of deployment. When configuring a stage in AWS CodePipeline, what does action mode determine? The duration of Amazon EC2 instances. The type of AWS Lambda function used. The size of Amazon EBS volumes. How actions are executed within that stage. Action mode in AWS CodePipeline determines how actions within a stage are executed, specifying whether they run sequentially or in parallel. What AWS service is commonly used as an action type in AWS CodePipeline to invoke serverless functions? AWS RDS. AWS EC2. Amazon S3. AWS Lambda. AWS Lambda is commonly used in AWS CodePipeline as an action type to invoke serverless functions as part of the pipeline's automated processes. What does AWS CodePipeline use to define the sequence of actions in a pipeline? A pipeline definition. An AWS SQSQ. An AWS IAM role. An Amazon SNS topic. AWS CodePipeline uses a pipeline definition to specify the sequence of actions that are to be executed in the pipeline. Which AWS service is commonly used as an action in AWS CodePipeline to build your application's source code? AWS CodeCommit. Amazon S3. AWS CodeBuild. AWS Lambda. AWS CodeBuild is often used as an action in AWS CodePipeline to compile, build, and package your application's source code. What is the purpose of using AWS CodePipeline with AWS Elastic Beanstalk? To manage AWS IAM users. To automate application deployments. To monitor AWS CloudTrail logs. To create Amazon S3 buckets. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS Elastic Beanstalk to automate the deployment of applications managed by Elastic Beanstalk, ensuring consistent and reliable application updates. When using AWS CodePipeline with multiple actions in a stage, how are those actions executed? In parallel. In reverse order. Sequentially. Randomly. Actions within a stage in AWS CodePipeline are executed in parallel, allowing for simultaneous processing of multiple actions. How does AWS CodePipeline facilitate integration with third-party services? Through Amazon S3 buckets. Through Amazon RDS connections. Through webhook integrations. Through AWS IAM roles. AWS CodePipeline facilitates integration with third-party services through webhook integrations, allowing external events to trigger pipeline executions automatically. When using AWS CodePipeline, where are pipeline artifacts stored during the pipeline execution? Amazon S3, AWS CloudWatch, Amazon RDS, Amazon DynamoDB. Pipeline artifacts in AWS CodePipeline are stored in Amazon S3 during the execution of the pipeline. What AWS service is often used as an action type in AWS CodePipeline to invoke serverless functions? AWS Lambda, AWS RDS, Amazon S3, AWS EC2. AWS Lambda is commonly used in AWS CodePipeline as an action type to invoke serverless functions as part of the pipeline's automated processes. What is the typical role of AWS Code Deploy in AWS CodePipeline? To manage AWS IAM roles. To deploy applications to a fleet of Amazon EC2 instances. To monitor AWS CloudTrail logs. To store application source code. AWS Code Deploy is used in AWS CodePipeline to automate the deployment of applications to a fleet of Amazon EC2 instances. What is an artifact in the context of AWS CodePipeline? A version file or set of files. An AWS IAM role. An Amazon VPC endpoint. An Amazon S3 bucket. An artifact in AWS CodePipeline refers to a version file or set of files produced by a pipeline's actions, such as build outputs or deployment packages. How does AWS CodePipeline integrate with AWS CodeBuild? As a serverless compute service. As an action provider. As a managed Kubernetes service. As a database service. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS CodeBuild as an action provider to perform build tasks within the pipeline. How does AWS CodePipeline handle the source stage in a pipeline? By performing static code analysis. By retrieving the latest revision of the source code. By triggering AWS Lambda functions. By monitoring Amazon VPC flow logs. AWS CodePipeline handles the source stage by retrieving the latest revision of the source code from the configured source provider. What is the purpose of using AWS CodePipeline alongside AWS CloudFormation? To automate infrastructure provisioning. To manage Amazon RDS databases. To monitor AWS CloudTrail logs. To create Amazon S3 buckets. AWS CodePipeline integrates with AWS CloudFormation to automate the provisioning of AWS infrastructure resources defined in CloudFormation templates. What is a webhook in the context of AWS CodePipeline? An Amazon VPC subnet. A mechanism to trigger a pipeline execution based on events. An AWS IAM policy. A type of AWS Lambda function. A webhook in AWS CodePipeline is used to trigger a pipeline execution automatically based on events from external systems, such as code commits or application updates. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and, if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.